This conference will now be recorded.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I just remembered.
The Nature Conservancy is one of the first land trusts in the world. They're now a global land trust. And of course, and they have chapters in every state in the country, and they're kind of the mother land trust. About 30 years ago is when the land trust movement across the nation really caught hold. North Coast Land Conservancies existed for about 35 years. So in the 50s, there were only 50 land trusts in about half the state. Now there's 1,500 land trusts across the nation. 20 of those are in Oregon alone. And the effect that we've had across the nation is 56 million acres of natural lands conserved. That's twice the acreage of national parks. And the effect that we have had in Oregon is triple the acreage of state parks. And so it's quite a movement and really starting to have a huge impact on the landscape in the communities in which we work. So we've been here since 1986. We serve Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties from the Columbia River down to Siletz Bay. And we hold ourselves to a really high standard. Of those 1,500 land trusts in the nation, only 450 of them have chosen to go through a rigorous process of accreditation. So a third party comes in, audits everything about how we run our business and tells us if we're doing it well or not. So we have chosen to go through that. We've been accredited for 5 years, which means we operate at the gold standard. And so this is our mission, helping to conserve Oregon's coastal lands forever. We do that to be a part of a greater vision for the Oregon coast, where people, plants, and wildlife can all thrive. The way that we participate in that larger vision, as I say, is really through owning land or managing land through agreements. And then we also facilitate conservation ownership. So I think this is a real critical one for county planners and municipalities to know about, is that we don't always have to be the owner at the end of the day, because that's really not the goal. The goal is for the land to be protected for its natural values that it brings, for its public benefit. So for example, we have expanded state parks. We've expanded Saddle Mountain State Park a couple of times. We've expanded Lewis and Clark National Park. We facilitated the Acola Creek Forest Reserve acquisition in the city of Cannon Beach. We've worked with the city of Seaside to acquire parks and open space. We've worked with the county a number of times, particularly in wetlands mitigation, where we become a landowner actually of mitigated wetlands. And most recently, we are working with the community of Arch Cape on the Arch Cape Community Forest Project. And so there we have a facilitation role where we bring our expertise of land transactions and forest management and land use planning, fundraising, and grant writing. And we are helping that community to own that land. We will not be the owner and long-term manager. So that's the difference between facilitation. Both result in there being a commitment in perpetuity of those lands being protected for their natural values. And so I put this up here since we might all have a chance to work together. I hope that as the comp plan comes together, that the city can really think about that there are some great organizations in the community that can help reach those goals, that the county doesn't have to do it alone, and can seek those of us in the community that want to help this kind of thing move forward. So these are the kinds of skills and expertise that we have on staff: land use planning, facilitation of meetings and community groups, stewardship and ecology, taking care of the land, doing restoration, planning for invasive species removal and native planting, etc. Public education, putting on programs, putting on hikes, putting on lectures. Fundraising, we do a lot of fundraising, both private and public dollars. So through asking for money, through doing campaigns, and through a lot of grant writing, so a lot of expertise there, and then technical expertise around GIS mapping and using mapping as a planning tool. So bringing in all kinds of layers into maps where you can then do prioritizations of whatever and have those maps light up and tell you where you want to go do your work. And then I think one of our maybe most important skills or expertise is really a value that we have of finding common ground. So we have a lot of beliefs and backgrounds within our community, and what North Coast Land Conservancy believes is that we all can find common ground in the ground itself, and we can all work together on this kind of thing regardless of our backgrounds. We can find this commonality. So we really work to have goodwill always left in the wake of anything we do. And this is our structure as a nonprofit governed by a board of directors, managed by me, the director, and we employ 9 staff. And we are supported by a lot of volunteerism. So community committees support our programs. Those are board members and others from the community. And they get a lot of work done for us. We have a lot of wonderful community volunteers. And we have an annual budget that hovers around $1 million. So far, this is our impact in terms of acres. We own 66 separate habitat reserves within that service area, and which is more than 4,700 acres. We have facilitated that additional amount of acres, and so we've had a total impact of more than 6,000 acres. For scale, that's maybe like 2 Oswald West State Parks. And speaking of, this is the project that we're working on right now, which is called the Rainforest Reserve. When we finish this Rainforest Reserve project, we will add 3,500 acres to that number. You're seeing the Rainforest Reserve here from its view of the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. So out in the ocean is the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. Then come up over Cape Falcon through Oswald West State Park, all the way up into this forest and into these highest mountains that we have in the Coast Range. And that is the Rainforest Reserve in and above the clouds. It is connected to the park and the Marine Reserve, and it will make an unprecedented conservation corridor of 32 square miles. And there's really nothing like this on the West Coast, let alone in Oregon, where you go from the high summits at 3,000 feet in the mountains all the way now out not only to the ocean, but into the ocean with a conservation corridor. And that's happening right here in our county. So why we do this is because we value the interconnectivity of all life. Back to our vision, it's about people and plants and fish and wildlife, and we do not each thrive individually unless we all thrive. And we think that this place is a national treasure, and it keeps us motivated every day to do the work that we do. It's why people visit from around the world. And when I look at what Goal 5 is forests, wetlands, watersheds, scenic and open spaces, it's like that's what people want. It's everything our county has, you know, it's pretty incredible. And people move here, people want to raise their families here, people flock from all around because of those attributes that are here. And so, North Coast Land Conservancy, we do our work generally across the whole landscape. And so all of those attributes of Goal 5 are something that we participate in and that we would love to continue to participate in, especially in partnership with the county as we envision the comprehensive plan. And of course, forests are something that are incredibly important in our county. They get talked about all the time. They often get talked about in terms of timber. There are other values to the forest as well, scenic, recreational, habitat, and of course, in the face of climate change, one of the most incredible values that they have right now is their ability to absorb and store carbon and mitigate our climate circumstances. And so, right now in Oregon, there are goals to reach net zero of carbon emissions. Scientists and policymakers have studied how to reach those goals. A lot of what we think of in terms of carbon emissions is, driving cars is a problem. We have to, move from gas to electric. That's a big one. We think about, maybe major factories and the types of pollutants that come out there. And that's like the gray infrastructure, the built environment that is contributing to carbon emissions. Well, Oregon has a goal by 2035 to start to get to net zero of carbon emissions. And in order to do that, the scientists look at all the ways in which we can change our infrastructure and our industry and our households and our energy use and our gasoline, and they can only get to 70% of that goal. Even with all the changes implemented, they can only get to 70%. The rest has to be done by the environment. And so 30% of the way Oregon is going to reach those goals is through natural lands protection. It's called natural climate mitigation solutions. And so that's all a lot of words for protecting forests. So right now, not only would timber be an incredible value for these forests out in Clatsop County, but it is our best chance at reaching our climate mitigation goals. When the scientists look at everything that Oregon's natural lands have to offer, they totally hone in on the temperate rainforests, Clatsop and Tillamook County. These forests are the most productive forests. They're some of the most productive forests in the world. So protecting these forests in terms of avoided deforestation or in terms of forest restoration, basically allowing trees to get bigger and grow for longer, makes it so that they will suck carbon out of the air and hold it. And that is how we're going to reach the goals. And so that's very important for Oregon. I think it's a very important thing for Clatsop County to take into account in our planning and to aspire to be a part of that statewide goal because it is our county that has the greatest potential to affect that. You're going to hear a whole lot more about wetlands from not only from Denise, but then again from Celeste. And so I won't go too much into it, except to say that the North Coast Land Conservancy has done an awful lot of wetlands protection. This is part of a estuarine wetlands corridor that is on the backside of Seaside along Neawanna Creek in the Nicanicum Estuary. Everything that you can see in this photo here, looking south to the side there is Tillamook Head, just to get oriented, kind of paralleling the highway here and Wahana Road. Everything you see here is in conservation, and so this particular part of the estuary will be protected forever. And it's part of a vision that the Land Conservancy really started with in our infancy. Over about 20 years, we did about 20 separate land transactions to bring these lands into the public benefit of conservation. And so some of those were a half acre, some of those were 40 acres. We put the vision out there that the Nicanicum Estuary was still a very natural estuary. Estuaries have all the wonderful benefits that Denise was just talking about, and there are very few natural estuaries left, and the Nicanicum was one of the few in Oregon that was still deemed a natural estuary. No dikes, no levees, very little development, still had the potential to have all of that fish and wildlife and water value. And so we set out to do that work. Kind of seemed maybe a little impossible in the beginning to set that kind of a vision, yet 20 years later, it's successful. So it's a great example of that it can be done. We can aspire towards these things, and we can come together and get them done. 20 years sounds like a long time when you start it, and then when you look back on it, it's like, poof, that just went by fast. And then, of course, watersheds. So watersheds is a hard one for me to pull out separately from the rest of the landscape, especially in this neck of the woods, because everywhere you look is a watershed. Everything is a watershed. And so, our forests and our water and our wetlands, our watersheds are all very interconnected, which is a theme that I am going to spend a little bit more time on talking about soon. But a healthy watershed, it delivers clean water to our taps, provides salmon habitat, beauty and solace. There's these waterfalls around our community that are just stunning. And again, sort of due to climate change, and other factors, we have declining salmon, we have sort of increasing development and visitation pressures. Those pressures directly affect our water because of the heavy water usage. That happens particularly in the summer. We have the least amount of water in our watersheds in the summer, and that's when people are pulling water into their taps the most. So watershed protection is pretty critical for direct human benefit and also for all of the fish and wildlife. So I think Clatsop County has a pretty great opportunity right now to within a planning process, really prioritize like those drinking watersheds that directly feed the community, the forests around those drinking watersheds. What kind of plans could be put into place around that natural infrastructure to ensure that water can keep being delivered into the future for the next generations of our Clatsopunians that will be here. And of course, scenic views. I mean, we all know that this is a big part of why we are here, why it's hard to leave, why people think they're going to move here temporarily and they never go away, why children think they're going to go away to college and never come back to their small town, and then they always do, is because it's so beautiful. And so, scenic views is just that, it's that big statement. But there are some very interesting ways to use planning tools to look at scenic views. GIS has incredible ways of looking at angles from a certain dot. And so you could look at places where people are the most and sort of angle that dot, and you would know what their view is from there and what are the most sort of scenic views. You can also do that from the highway. Scenic 101 is a scenic byway. From the highway, you can also use those tools to see what that scenic driving experience is like. And so things that used to sound nearly impossible are much easier, quite easy actually, with GIS mapping technology now. And so I think there's great opportunity to have scenic views be one of those important layers as we're looking at, what forests have the best potential for storing carbon, what watersheds are most critical to delivering water to our taps, where within there are there also our most stunning scenic views. And then, bam, those are the spots on the map that we put an awful lot of attention to make sure that those places remain forever. That's the kind of work NCLC does directly. It's also the kind of work that we could help the county envision or even implement. And then open spaces is part of Goal 5, and similar to scenic views, it kind of describes like something about the character of a community. We have a rural character. We expect open space to be a part of our lives out here in the county, but that will not be true unless we plan for it. It has been true for all these years, but of course we have massive increased pressure of development and visitation. People have discovered Clatsop County. So many people have moved to Oregon and Portland, and so many more will. You've maybe heard the term like climate refugees. People already have been coming from California forever. Well, now they have to, they have to flee their homes because of wildfire and desertification that's happening. And they're going to come to the land of beauty and water up here in Oregon, sort of whether we like it or not. And this is going to be their coast. And so planning for open spaces is a really good idea, and totally possible still. I have to admit that I moved here from California. I've now had children here and they're Oregonians, so I feel like that helps me with my credibility a little bit. But I am one of those. I moved from California, and I left California pretty intentionally because this is the kind of work I love to do, and this is my passion, is around natural lands. And I felt like where I was in California was kind of already ruined, and that there wasn't a lot of potential for me to do that here. And then I came out to the North Coast, and it has just been like a dream come true to feel like, oh my gosh, I can do something now with this wonderful community and these wonderful volunteers and staff I get to work with. We can do something now that people generations from now will just take for granted, and it will have enhanced their quality of life, you know, sort of whether they knew it or not. And to me, that's a really amazing privilege to be able to be a part of planning something like that. So open space, I think, is more than just, should be more than just there being something left over. I think it's very worth planning specifically for open spaces, not only for that character of the community, but also because it can solve problems. You know, here's these elk. We know a lot about the elk in Clatsop County. We hear a lot about the elk in Gerhardt these days. And without open spaces for animals to migrate and move, we're just going to have more and more of those conflict problems. And you know, not only with wildlife being in our communities, in our backyards where we don't want them, but you know, sort of more importantly, the difficulty and safety issues that we face on the highway. So, so again, planning for open space, I would just really encourage us to use all the tools that we have to plan where we want open space and why, rather than open space just being something that happens because it's left over from a development. And so the way in which NCLC approaches achieving that large vision of ours is really using this principle of connectivity. And I want to share about connectivity because I think it's an excellent planning tool, and particularly in this Goal 5, it's an amazing very useful way to think of it. So, you know, connectivity, ecological connectivity, is about unimpeded movement, you know, for species and for flow, like Denise was talking about, with even with sea level rise. You know, natural areas and water and animals, they need space to thrive, and they need places to be able to move. This earth is not a stagnant place. It never has been. It never will be. We have tended as humans to do our planning as if it is stagnant. We have an opportunity now with our knowledge to plan for the fact that things change and move over time. And connectivity planning allows those changes to occur successfully. And so people already know about connectivity. You know, it's increased. You can have increased capacity of a system when you're working with interconnected systems. And so ecological connectivity is a conservation principle that we use all the time. And but this term here, green infrastructure, is really a planning term. And I find it to be a very helpful way to think about how you can achieve all these different things that I've just been talking about without feeling overwhelmed or feeling like, well, geez, we can't just save everything, you know, and we don't need to. We don't need to, you know, look at the land and just think it's an all or nothing thing. Because if we use this concept of green infrastructure and connectivity, we can support the most important parts knowingly, because we've understood the land, we know what's the most important. So it's our natural life support system, a system of interconnected natural areas and waterways. And I'm going to share just a couple diagrams here, and then I'm going to liken it to systems we're more familiar with. So like in this diagram, you have these hubs, you have these corridors, and then you have these little sites in between. And then all that white space, you know, that's development, probably. That's where there's an awful lot of human use going on. But you can see that with this system, we haven't cut off the corridors. So if you don't plan for it, it'd be very easy to just do one small development that totally cuts off a corridor, and then bam, you've lost your connectivity. That means you might have elk on the highway. It means you might have fish running up against a culvert they can't get through. And it means you might have flooding on your road. You know, that's the kind of effect that happens when you break up the natural life support system. It has direct effect on people and on our infrastructure. So green infrastructure is a lot like gray infrastructure. It's the concept of, for instance, we always plan out our road network ahead of time because it's a network. It doesn't work in pieces. You could have the same amount of pieces of road, same amount of surface area, but if they're not all connected, it isn't going to deliver the service of transportation. And so as planners, we plan out the road network well ahead of time, and then we build up around it so that we make sure that that movement of cars and that service of transportation is uninterrupted. And also, like in our bodies, you know, we have our heart and our brain, then we have all these appendages, and we really can't exist without our heart and our brain, and those things need to be connected to be able to let the rest of our system work. But we actually can survive without just everything. You know, you can have compromised systems within here, but it's really hard if you have a compromised heart and brain. So the heart and brain are like the hubs of the system. You know, the hubs of the natural system, you could liken them to the really important interchanges on the highway. Like, you can't have your system work unless you know that those hubs are there and that they are connected to the rest. And so you can plan like that on green infrastructure. You look at streams, you look at drinking watersheds, you look at where they cross in development, and you make sure that the key connections are there. And again, GIS tools allow us to do this well ahead of time. It's much easier than it ever was before. And green infrastructure isn't something that I came up with. It's a very common type of planning tool these days. And so I'm just sharing some other images. If you Google green infrastructure, you will find thousands of images and hundreds of stories about communities who have used it as their planning tool. And you can see how it's showing the whole system, how not everything has to be green for the infrastructure to work, and how folks like me who work in conservation, we don't have an expectation that everything is natural, because of course we live in houses and we work in buildings and we drive cars too. And so it's more just knowing that if you plan it ahead of time, that what you can achieve when you plan for connectivity is far greater than if you just end up with stuff left over, the pieces left over. And so this is an example, a local example that I'm going to use because I think we're all quite familiar with it, and it kind of pulls together everything here that I've been talking about. And so so this map on the left, this is a map of, this is the Nicanicum estuary in the blue heading south to Tillamook Head. All of this red, all the red blobs are all those individual acquisitions I was talking about that happened over 20 years along Neawanna Creek. So you can see that the green infrastructure on the backside of Seaside here has been very much conserved. There are streams coming down off the hillsides here that have salmon spawning beds and new developments next to them, yet the salmon can make it through. There is no flooding that happens along Wahana Road, yet the tide in here is incredibly high in the winter. It fills all of those marshy lands. And it's because that green infrastructure was protected that you don't see flooding on the backside. And then when you get to the south end of town, you get to Circle Creek. And so on this red blob map, Circle Creek is at the very bottom of the map. And it is really a hub of this network system of the green infrastructure here. It has forest, it has wetlands, it has watersheds, it has floodplain. It's 364 acres, formerly a farm. The farmer wanted to sell it to conservation, didn't want it to be developed. And so the Land Conservancy bought it about 16 years ago. And to get oriented, on the north side is the golf course. In the little elbow, sort of oxbow area, is the Circle Creek Golf Course. Also on towards the north end is the relief pitcher and the helicopter pad. And so all of this gets flooded. The Nicanicum River comes off of Saddle Mountain, and it all meets its maker. All streams come together right before they enter Seaside. It's a massive amount of water. And what we know is that for a long time, that massive amount of water ended up on the highway. And that was because there was a levee along Circle Creek. And that massive amount of water is supposed to be there. It's just that that road was going right through the place where all that water was supposed to be. So water is supposed to flood out across floodplains. It brings nutrients to the soil. It's essentially like, you know, composting your garden, putting fertilizer out on your garden. It replenishes the environment, these flood events. But when we have infrastructure built up around it, it also causes problems. And so we removed the levee as a partnership with the county and with the cities and with the highway department, because we were a landowner who was willing to be flooded. It's a part of our goal to reconnect this ecosystem. It's going to be great for salmon and for birds and for storing water and filtering pollutants. And so that was a part of our goal, and we said, sure, let's remove that levee. So a bunch of studies were done to see how that would affect the highway. And for about $1 million, we implemented a project to remove the levee. And I think most of you have probably been able to drive Highway 101 in the winter every time since. It dropped the level of water that flooded the highway by an entire foot. And so that was $1 million project. Had we done a gray, and that's what I would call a green infrastructure solution. Had we done a gray infrastructure solution there, we would have had to raise the road or create a bridge or a causeway. The minimum alternative cost to doing that was going to be $10 million. And so this green infrastructure not only is great for the fish and wildlife benefits, but there is a direct benefit that came back to the citizens because we saved $9 million in tax dollars being spent on an infrastructure project. So that kind of planning going forward can solve all kinds of problems because Clatsop County is not broken, it is not overrun, it is not overdeveloped yet. And so we have this opportunity to plan for essentially, you know, those solutions being laid out before they even become problems. And so just real quick, I'm just going to share some of the things that NCLC did just in this last year in terms of our stewardship of the land. All that land that we own, we then take care of, again, for the public benefit of natural lands. We accomplished a lot of this work with volunteers. Great community of people come out. Many of you on this are those people. Thank you for being such a great part of the community. Hikes and walks on the land, public education, restoring land to the First Nations people, bringing back land for the Clatsops, and somehow successfully raising an awful lot of money to accomplish the Rainforest Reserve project. And I just share that because I think of NCLC as a small group of people. I think we've done great big things, and I just imagine what we could do all together if we want to set some of these awesome goals for Clatsop County. So what I love about the comprehensive plan is that it's an aspirational document, and I guess I'm here to say that NCLC is here as a partner and a resource to let us feel free to be aspirational. And so if you want to learn more about us, you can check us out on the web and all kinds of places. I'll be giving some talks, and we'll have some fun virtual trivia night events and stuff coming up. And it'd be great if I saw y'all there. So thank you so much. And now I have to figure out how to pass the screen. And I'm going to make Victoria the presenter so that she can put up Celeste's presentation. I think that worked.
Great, thanks, Katie. That was an awesome presentation. I think you said it all. I don't think we could do any better than that. So my name is Celeste Levo, and I work for the North Coast Watershed Association. And I'm going to talk about watershed councils and how they can be used as a tool to help implement the policies and guidelines of the comprehensive plan. I wasn't able to share my screen, so Victoria is going to run my presentation for me. So it might be a little awkward, but I think we'll get through. So to begin with, I noticed that Angie Riesland is also on this meeting. Angie, could you unmute yourself? Angie is the coordinator for the Nicanicum Watershed Council, and I would just love to invite Angie to jump into this presentation at any point. She's been working for the Watershed Council much longer than I have, and I'm sure she has a lot of wisdom that she could share with us.
Oh, I don't know about that. It's your presentation, Celeste, so I'll jump in if there's something there, but I haven't seen this, so I don't know. I'm not prepared.
Yeah, of course, but if you want to share anything, please jump in. So so in Clatsop County, we have 4 watershed councils. The North Coast Watershed Association is a combination of several different watersheds. So we've divided ourselves into a river council and a coastal council. Our river council includes the Big Creek, Nicolay, Wickiup watersheds east of Astoria, and then the Skippon watershed, which is around the Hammond and Warrenton area. And then the Youngs Bay watershed, which would include Astoria and Saddle Mountain. And then down on the coast, we have the Coastal Council. And that would include everything from Tillamook Head at Ecola State Park down to Necarney Creek in Oswald West State Park. So that would be Cannon Beach, Arch Cape, all of those places. And then the Nicanicum Watershed Council, of course, as you can imagine, it includes the Nicanicum watershed. So it's, there we go. So the Nicanicum Watershed Council is based out of the city of Seaside, and it works its way all the way up into the Clatsop Plains through the Neocoxie Wildlife Corridor. And then the Upper Nehalem Watershed Council is a really big part of the county. Maggie Payton is the coordinator for that council, and her office is based in Vernonia. But she's been with her watershed council, I think, longer than any other coordinator on the coast, well over 20 years, and she really knows her watershed. And then the Lower Columbia Watershed Council is up in the very right northeast part of our county, and they have just a little bit of area that they work with us on. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say there. So you can switch to the next slide, Victoria. So my focus of my talk is just to talk about watershed councils in general. All of Goal 5 is just the work that we do. It's the work that the North Coast Land Conservancy does, CREST, the Watershed Council, the Clatsop Soil and Water Conservation District. That is our work. And so as you're thinking about, drafting language and thinking about goals that you want to craft, think about us as your tool to getting those goals accomplished. And so just going back just to watershed councils are community-based, they're voluntary. Very importantly, they're non-regulatory. Often folks think that we're part of the government and we have a regulatory arm to us, but we don't. We're non-regulatory. We're a grassroots collection of folks from all different backgrounds that are trying to do good work to protect their watershed. And as Katie pointed out, everywhere you look, you're within a watershed, and watersheds are defined by the ridge tops that we live in. So from ridge top to ridge top, you can think all of the water that drains down in that basin is a watershed. So a watershed includes all the streams and rivers, all of the lakes, the groundwater, the communities, the habitats, the people, the wildlife, everything that's in between. And so watershed councils, their work is to focus on enhancing that basin through improving water quality, restoring fish passage, making sure native plant communities are healthy. And I would just point out too that Oregon is one of the few states that has this community-based model, which is pretty great. Next slide. And so as I was mentioning, watershed councils work with all different levels within our communities. We work with local folks, private landowners, the state, federal partners. And what we do is we try to be that neutral body that brings all of these different viewpoints and ideas for how we can accomplish the work within a watershed, bring all those folks together and find a solution that meets our goals. Some of the projects you're probably really familiar. One of the projects that watershed councils really focus on is providing fish passage. So could be replacing culverts and installing a bridge instead, maybe planting riparian plants along a stream to cool the water temperature. Our particular group of folks with the Watershed Association, we have a water quality program. So we have 25 places out within the area that we work where we're collecting temperature data to track how healthy our streams are. And then just to really stress this, our councils are designated by county governments, but they're expected to have a broad and balanced representation. And we do that through our board of directors. So the board directs the work of the council, and the board represents all of the communities that the watershed works in. So on our board, we have a representative from the Coastal Council. We have someone from the Nikolai Wikiup, Chris, who's on this call. He's our guy out there. We have someone that's also works on the Clatsop Soil and Water Conservation District Board. So from all different private timber folks, state forestry, local urban areas, all the different backgrounds. So we want to make sure, just like Katie was mentioning with the North Coast Land Conservancy, we really want to make sure we're hearing everybody's voice and that everyone has ownership in our work. Next slide. So within Oregon, there are 59 watershed councils, and the primary source of funding for a watershed council comes from a state agency called the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And OWEB, as they are known, receives all their funding through lottery tickets and a fund called the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund. And so what OWEB does is it provides a capacity grant to each of the watershed councils, and that funds our staff time. And then on top of that, they will also provide funding for project work. So we work with OWEB to secure funding to do whatever projects our board and stakeholders think are should be a priority within our watershed. And as you know, probably with the recent pandemic and the shutdown that happened within Oregon, lottery ticket sales really went down in quantity, and so OWEB had to put a brake on their funding, and so that really impacts our work because we're really dependent on them as our primary source of funding. So it's been a really important goal of watershed councils is to find other funding sources to do our work. And so, yeah, I think I've covered that. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Victoria.
Celeste, can I just point out too, this is Angie with the Mechanical Watershed Council. I just wanted to mention that it's a really great way, while we're all struggling to find funding, to leverage resources and partner on things. So like right now, the Mechanical Watershed Council is partnering with the city of Seaside to do a bridge replacement, or well, a culvert replacement project with a bridge on Wahana Road, which will, the grant is for like $355,000, and we're able to save the city having to pay that money by partnering with them to get that funding for them. So that's a really good role of a watershed council, is to partner with county people, with city people, with all the partners we can to bring us all together to get the funding that we need, so that one person doesn't have to find, $600,000 to do a bridge. So just wanted to point that out, that watershed councils are a great vehicle for people to come together and find funding and partner.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Angie. That's great. That's a really great example. And I'll just add to that, the North Coast Watershed Association just partnered with Crest to do a project we call the John Day Crossing Project. And Denise, if you wanted to talk about that, it was a project where we took out some old small culverts and replaced it with a bridge. It was a road that flooded all the time, and now there's full connectivity between the river and the wetlands. And that was just like Angie was talking about, that was a way for both of our organizations to help each other accomplish a project that was very expensive. So, so again, about watershed councils, councils are very diverse. They work in all sorts of different ways. As I was mentioning, the North Coast Watershed Association is a group of a lot of different councils, or I'm sorry, of different watersheds that used to all be separate watershed councils. The Lower Columbia Watershed Council, the coordinator for that is a contractor, and so their capacity is much lower than folks that have full-time staff. At the Nicanicum Watershed Council, Angie is the sole proprietor and worker of that organization, so she's got a lot on her plate. And then the Upper Nehalem Watershed Council, Maggie has a few staff that help her get that work done. But we're all operating at different levels of capacity. And like Angie pointed out, we're always looking for ways to partner with others to accomplish our work. Next slide. So just like other watershed councils, our mission and our vision are very similar. We want to improve the watershed health through community-based efforts, and that just pretty much says it all. One of the things that the North Coast Watershed Association has acknowledged within the region that they work is how important salmon are to our livelihood. And so it was important for our organization to call that out in our vision, that we know that bringing back the social, economic, and ecological role of salmon within the work that we do will not only improve the health of our watershed, but it's also going to improve the health of our communities. And so that's really the overarching goal that helps guide our work. Next slide. So what I did, hopefully this can, oh, I just got a note from Linda to ask me to turn on my camera, and it's not working. I'm sorry, Linda. I wish I could. So, so one of the things that I did is I went ahead and looked in the comprehensive plan to see what goals and policies could relate back to the work that the Watershed Council does, and point them out as places where the Watershed Council could help get that goal or policy accomplished. So the overall goal of Goal 5 is to protect the natural resources and conserve scenic and historic areas and open spaces. So again, all of the work that we do collectively through CREST, North Coast Land Conservancy, and the Watershed Councils, and I also just mentioned Columbia Clatsop Soil and Water Conservation District. All of our work is meant to accomplish that goal. But within the guidelines for Goal 5, number 4, fish and wildlife areas and habitats should be protected and managed in accordance with the Oregon Wildlife Commission. So that's really what the Watershed Council does. Every time we do a project, we have to show how our project is, the scope of work for our project relates back to any wildlife management plans like the Oregon Conservation Strategy or the any management plans that have been done locally or within the county. So we're always looking at these guiding documents to inform the work that we do and to make sure we're staying on track with what was decided by local residents and city and county groups. And then also number 5, stream flow and water levels. So like I mentioned, the Watershed Association has a water quality monitoring program, and so we're helping find and collect information about how our stream health, how the health of our streams are changing. As Katie pointed out, our coastal communities are really impacted during the most vulnerable time of the year, during the summer when water levels are the lowest and we have the most people here on the coast using the water. So it's important for us to keep tracking that so we know that we're not impacting the resources to a point that we can't repair them over time. Next slide. And so then I looked into the wetland policies, and wetland policy number 1, that the county is going to protect identified significant freshwater wetlands for which no conflicting uses have been identified. Freshwater wetlands, streams, rivers, those are all places that the Watershed Council works. And so we can really act as that intermediary between different groups and trying to come together to make sure that we're protecting these really special places. And as I'm sure has been pointed out already, our watersheds are not only provide critical habitat for fish and native plant communities and wildlife, but they're our sources of drinking water. And with our changing climate, they're going to become more and more critical to be protected. And so all of the work that we're doing is going to become more and more important. Within the natural area policies, policy number 2, the county will cooperate with appropriate state and federal groups to ensure that there's an examples of the full range of Oregon's natural ecosystem. I really think that that policy speaks to what the North Coast Land Conservancy does, but also when you're looking at that policy is asking you to also study those ecosystems. One of the things that the Watershed Council does is they have a watershed assessment for every watershed that they work in. And so those are really extensive documents that look into all of the biological and abiotic environmental factors, everything you want to know about a watershed environmentally. The watershed assessment pulls that into one document. So our watershed assessments are quite old. They're from the 1990s, and that's one of the projects that we really want to do next is to update our watershed assessments. Next slide. And then within the water resources policy, policies 1, 2, and 3 connect back to the Watershed Council. Just thinking about how all of these groups are being asked to work together, whether it's through state and federal agencies, assuring that we have the maximum beneficial use of all water, and that our water quality planning and implementation activities are carried out by agencies and overseen by agencies like the Department of Environmental Quality and the Soil and Water Conservation Commission. All of those groups are involved in the work that we do. And so, like I mentioned with the water quality monitoring program, all of our data goes back to the Department of Environmental Quality so they can help us track the health of our streams and rivers. And then thinking about forests, Katie talked a lot about forests and how important that our coastal forests are to where we live. And a lot of our projects are done with private timber companies, and sometimes there can be a lot of conflict between what folks down lower in the watershed want with their forests and the folks that are up and higher in the watershed are doing to manage those forests. And the Watershed Council can be, like I mentioned before, be that in-between neutral body that can bring those groups together to talk about how we can come up with a solution to manage the forest, protect the streams, and make sure we're providing the best habitat for both people and fish. Next slide. And so just going back to our map, I just want to reiterate that the watershed councils are a tool for you to use. We can help you accomplish the goals and policies and guidelines to your comprehensive plan. I've also included the websites for each of the watershed councils. So wherever you live in your county, I please just encourage you to reach out to your local watershed council. Each watershed council has council meetings plus board meetings that are open to the public. And we're here for you. We're here to make sure that your voice is heard. So please get involved and engaged. And if you have any questions, I guess we'll just wait until the end when you guys are starting to go through your worksheets. But please just let me know. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. I've got a question for you, Celeste, from Ian Sisson, my coworker. He says, what is the time frame to complete the watershed assessment updates?
We don't have a particular deadline. There's nothing that says that we have to get them done at a certain time, but we're way overdue. So what's really holding us back right now is the funding to get them done. But I would just encourage you guys to go in and look at the Siuslaw Watershed Council website. They have a storyboard framework on their website that shows that they've taken their watershed assessment and they've put it on their webpage. And it's so well done, and I think it's really accessible. And so if you look at that, that's what our goal is to accomplish, is to do something similar to what the Siuslaw Watershed Council did with their assessment. And so that's really my job right now, is to find the money to figure out how we're going to do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, silent round of applause for everyone. So now it would be a great time if you have had any questions as you've been going through your worksheets, and I'm addressing the Citizen Advisory Committee members specifically, but of course anyone is welcome to jump in. If you've had any questions while you've been going through the policies and goals that you feel like you've been wanting an expert answer on, we have these amazing people here, so please fire away.
This is Cheryl, and I have a question. Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
This is Cheryl Johnson, and I'm the Citizen Advisory Council for Northeast Clatsop County. And then I'm also the liaison from Northeast to the countywide Citizen Advisory. And I have a question for Denise with CREST, and it's not specifically related to our worksheets, but more to her presentation. The habitat restoration that you all did on Bear Creek and Mary's Creek and Ferris Creek is awesome. And so that happened in 2018. And the comp plan that we're working with has sort of not been updated much since the 80s. So I'm wondering, Denise, if you have suggestions or recommendations for us. What kind of policies should we be looking at? What kind of guidelines could we be looking at? For instance, just to protect the incredible work that's been done on those 3 streams.
Oh, thank you. That's a really great question. And so what I think is going to be useful for the committee going forward is the inventory of the wetlands that's going to occur over the next few months. And Gail, feel free to hop in here if at any point. And so there's going to be an inventory that's going to be done on across the county, looking at wetlands and doing an update to the inventory. And so and then as that occurs, I think what will be helpful around that is then that inventory will be able to be brought back to the committee to look to see what's changed in terms of wetlands across the landscape. And then at that point, I think the discussion will be, I think one of the questions is, where has there been restored wetlands? Where are there larger wetlands where protections may need to be put in place? And what types of protections those should be? And I think those questions will be answered more then, because I've spoken with Gail about this, and what really, I think what the committee really needs is an understanding of, because the comp plans, as you mentioned, is quite old, and there's a report called the Duncan Thomas report where there was an inventory done, and there's kind of protections in place for specific wetlands across the county, and it's older, and so there will be a new inventory. You'll get to see where these wetlands are now and get to have a conversation about what kind of protections should be in place around them going forward. And so my hope is that the restored wetlands will be part of that conversation. Does that answer your question, Cheryl? Okay, good.
This is Ian Sisson, County Planner. I had a follow-up question regarding the wetland inventories. I know the group that I liaise for is the Southwest Coastal Planning Area, and that group seems particularly interested in looking at ways we could regulate wetland activity or development in or near wetlands at a greater level than is done by the state of Oregon through the Division of State Lands. Are there any particular areas that you feel are lacking in what the state regulates that would be a good place for the county to sort of fill in with its own local rules?
Ian, do you mean geographically, or do you mean kind of like types of protections?
Types of protections. For example, I know one big issue that has been brought up is the sort of pay-to-play system where you could mitigate, and this is a very simplified way of looking at it, but where you could basically do whatever you want in wetlands if you have the capital.
Yeah, well, and in terms, I think there's places where we could. So one of the things that we've been talking about internally at CREST is taking a look at other jurisdictions and who might have stronger wetland protections in place in their comp plans, in their ordinances, and seeing if those might be ones that could be adapted for Clatsop County. And so that's something that we were thinking about looking into and kind of investigating. And Katie, Celeste, if you guys have suggestions around this, please feel free to speak up. But those are some of kind of what we were thinking is ways we could strengthen protections, particularly around larger wetland complexes that may need larger buffers. And some of what I was talking about in terms of this would be less maybe down in the southern portions of the county, but in places where we have estuaries, thinking about wetlands and the way that they may move over time. And so making sure that they have some room to do that. And so buffers are something that's really important. And then just, you know, if there are some wetlands that are so important that they just should not be developed, figuring out if there's ways to protect them, with the understanding that there are some initiatives that have passed at the statewide level that can make some of that challenging. So, you know, Ian, that may be kind of, in some ways, in some instances, will probably be more of a case-by-case basis of being like, these wetland complexes are very important. How do we protect them? And then there's other wetlands where we may talk about different types of protections. And so it's going to be a balancing act, I think, going forward.
I could just sort of reinforce that, Denise, and add that layer of connectivity to it, that if, you know, it's going to be a pretty great resource to have this wetlands prioritization updated and the inventory updated. And so, you know, the county could then voluntarily do something of a, you know, sort of connectivity, green infrastructure approach to looking at those wetlands, because a lot of them are going to be very close together and others are going to be very far apart. Those that are close together have a lot of potential to then come together in really meaningful corridors. It allows for that buffer and that movement to happen. So even if it's voluntarily, or, you know, just having that kind of a planning tool can be so powerful to decide to do that, because then it's available, you know, and if developments come or if controversy comes, then we can all know, like, well, yeah, we all do deem that really important. Maybe there's another way, you know, if the law isn't directly supporting it, maybe that landowner can be compensated in other ways, you know, to be able to bring it into protection.
I have a question, may I ask? I'm a representative for the Southwest Citizens Advisory Committee, as well as the countywide advisory committee, and we are tasked with revising these goals for Goal 5 and the one that's on the screen and all of the rest of them. And among them, there are many that are obviously dated out of existence. They don't have any relevance any longer. And then there are others, such as you just mentioned, that would be goals that would be very valuable to have in here. Is it possible that the watershed councils or whoever is above them could review these and give us a report of what the recommendations are for eliminating some or maybe adding others?
Crest is already working. We've been working with Gail, with the county, to assist with this process. It's going to take us a little while, but we do plan to go through and take a look at the current policies, and then make suggestions as to ones that, as to how to update them, for the group to consider. So Crest is already going to, we haven't started, but we are going to be kind of helping in that way.
Do you have a time time commitment at all on that?
Yeah, we're planning to have, we're assisting with the inventory as well, and so we're planning to have the inventory and the policy review drafted and completed for the committee to look at in January of 2021.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Victoria, this is Cheryl. I have another question, but I already got to ask one. So if somebody else wants to jump in with a question, I would be glad to wait my turn.
This is Christopher R. speaking. I'm not one of the CAC members, but I do sit on the County Planning Commission, and I'm also on the North Coast Watershed Association Board. And I don't really have a question. It's kind of a question and it's kind of a comment. We keep reflecting back on the fact that we're revising a comp plan that is nearly 40 years old. So it actually gives us the possibility of taking a look historically, how well did that plan work to meet the goals that it had set out? And that could go for any of the goals in the comp plan, but it seems especially worthwhile to try to use what's happened in the last 40 years to our wetlands, our open spaces, and natural wildlife habitat areas. And I'd say probably we didn't come out real well, and maybe we could try to look at why that is, or if it's surprisingly that we protected almost all the wetlands in the last 40 years that we ever could have. That'll be some good news, and we know that we'll keep those policies then. But has anybody taken a look at what has happened over the last 40 years and why the comp plan didn't do as well as it might have? It's one of my impossible questions I always get accused of asking.
This is Cheryl Johnson from Northeast CAC. Katie, you talked about that the watershed areas are part of the natural climate mitigation and that we need 30% to come from that. Obviously, this is sailing into uncharted territory for us. I'm wondering, do you have some wording to suggest to us? Do you have some policies to suggest to us? All of the people who've spoken today, you and Denise from Crest and all of you, your knowledge of watersheds is so much deeper than ours as citizens who are just coming in to deal with this huge, very important issue, you know, with minimum expertise. So do you have suggestions for rowing the boat in this new direction?
Well, I could certainly think about that a little bit. I mean, just off the cuff, even just in a general way, like crafting that type of a statement that that would say Clatsop County values its forests and its watersheds for many reasons, including its potential ability to mitigate climate change. And that we understand that to reach Oregon's goals, that the North Coast forests are some of the most important natural lands in our state to reach that goal. And so that could be, you know, sort of a potential just sort of guiding statement for then to have other goals set under. I will offer that there's scientific articles that go into great detail about this. A woman named Rose Graves was just published. I'd be happy to share that with Victoria if that seems helpful for the group. She talks about it quite specifically, what all this means. And there is a good amount of planning, prioritization, and mapping that has happened across the state around what they call resilient landscapes. And so the Nature Conservancy has done a project in all of the Pacific Northwest where they have used, you know, just a bunch of different sort of data points, brought them all together to then highlight the map and say, where are the most resilient lands? And those lands remaining natural would be the highest priority, you know, in terms of climate mitigation. And also just using the term resilient is because those lands have the best potential to be able to handle the change and still provide the values of habitat and water and carbon sequestration, etc. And so that is information that is known. There's a good amount of work that has been done for us already. And so knowing that, you know, you can then start to pull some things together and you can look at those maps and be like, wow, here's the map of the most resilient lands in Clatsop County. Here's the map of drinking watersheds. And here's the new wetlands inventory map. What I would then do is say, where do all of those maps overlap? And wherever all of those maps overlap, those are the most important lands in Clatsop County from a green infrastructure, sort of natural protection standpoint. And they will serve the citizens of Clatsop County forever. So that type of a tool would be, you know, a really amazing benefit, and it is not out of reach at all.
Got a message from Cheryl Conway on the chat. She says, isn't there a monetary value to climate change mitigation we can offer to the rest of Oregon, the US? Farmers are being paid now to store more carbon in their fields. Why can't we market ourselves?
We can. And so, yes, forest owners and agricultural owners, landowners who choose to keep their lands in a condition that stores carbon do have more and more access to like carbon offset dollars and carbon mitigation dollars. And so those funding sources are becoming greater and greater.
On that same note, this is Ian Sisson again in the County Planning Department. Are there any Oregon local government jurisdictions you're aware of that are doing anything like that, incentivizing those things locally?
So I'm stepping out of my bounds a little bit here, but I'm pretty sure that Lincoln City or even Lincoln County was going to try to pass an ordinance, and I forget how it all shook out, but that's worth looking into. And I would just throw it out there, since we're being aspirational, that like open space bond measures are some of the most supported bond measures and like legislation by both parties across the nation. Open space bond measures pass as funding like 90% of the time or something. It's a pretty incredible statistic. And I think that Clatsop County could have a really amazing opportunity to explore things like that. Not that it has to be done tomorrow, but to not let the budget feel so hamstringing, because a lot of people care about this type of thing, people from all kinds of backgrounds, and are willing to allow themselves to be a little bit more text for that kind of thing. It's one of the things that we often come together around is that type of legislation and bond measures. We just saw that in the federal government, even with how divided we are right now as a nation politically. We just passed some of the greatest public lands funding initiative that's ever been passed, fully funding the Land and Water Conservation Initiative. And so, so I put it out there because there's a lot of counties and cities across the nation that have very successfully passed open space bond measures. The counties themselves can then spend that money for creating parks, for funding parks master planning and parks programs, and then they can also offer that funding to others. And so there's a real, that, you know, combined with the movement around, you know, carbon offset mitigation, there are definitely very new, sort of innovative and doable ways in which funding can be brought in to support this kind of thing.
I have a question that would go probably to Katie or to Denise on their GIS coverages. As you're probably aware, the Oregon Department of Forestry is right now in the midst of, or maybe winding up the first draft of a habitat conservation plan. And there's a lot to the plan, and I couldn't possibly very quickly go through all that it entails, but part of it is essentially to set aside certain areas of state forest, and part of that's in Clatsop County, that would be protected and managed very differently than they ordinarily do for timber harvesting. And the principal objective is to provide steady habitat for listed species. And those habitat areas are fairly numerous in Clatsop County and cover quite an acreage. And there'll be little disturbance in those areas. There may be some selective cutting and so forth. But at any rate, these would be areas where you go back to Katie's idea of overlapping maps and seeing where you kind of get the most bang for the buck, the most things that overlap, watersheds that provide drinking water, good habitat for wildlife, good stream habitat for fish, and good recreational opportunities, all those things rolled into one. So it seems that it would be really worthwhile to get the latest coverages of where the Oregon Department of Forestry is considering these habitat conservation areas. I believe those would be made available to you. They're subject to change, but a lot of them are probably going to stand the test of time, and there's no reason to not at least take what's on the plan right now and take a look at them to see how they relate to other things we might want to preserve. Anyway, it's just thought.
Thanks, Chris. I put it on the list.
Cheryl made a comment in the chat. Cheryl, would you mind voicing what you wrote down there, if you're still here?
Yeah, what I wrote in there is that our draft of Goal 4, which is forests, is currently listed on the county website, and so it's available for review. And my suggestion, my request was, it would be great if Crest and NCLC and the Watershed folks could find time to read it and to comment. I know that y'all don't need any extra work to do, and they're already reading lots of documents, but that first draft of what we've done is out there. And because the watersheds and then the forests overlap so much, it would be great to have your eyes look at that and to have input from you.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm making a note that I could bring these drafts to our conservation committee, and then there'd be a little force of community membership around review of that. So that might be a way that we could offer some comment.
And Cheryl, would we submit our comments to you? I'm sorry, this is Angie with the Nicanagon Watershed Council. Would we submit our comments? Who would we submit our comments to?
Victoria or Gail need to take that question.
Hi, sorry, I buried my mute button underneath the documents. Yeah, you can send them to us, send them to Gail or to the regular ComDev email, which is comdev@co.clatsup.or.us, and then we'll review the materials and make that a part of our agenda packets that we send out every month to the CAC members.
Okay, thank you.
This is Ian Sisson again. I hope I'm not taking anyone else's turn. I just wanted to ask all of the speakers, I like how Katie framed the comprehensive plan, as an aspirational document, which it is. And it also turns into policies that get implemented by our zoning ordinance. And so I'm wondering what kind of aspirational policies, if you have any in mind, would help your organizations achieve your missions. For example, one I know that has already come up is a lot of the time we require conditional use permits for restoration projects, which can be a cumbersome process. So looking at potentially, making it easier to do that kind of work. Another one that comes to mind would be specifically listing projects or land acquisitions into the public domain, because obviously those things can lead to a greater likelihood of getting things like grant funding or other money coming through to support those projects if they're listed in a plan document. So are there any other ideas you all have for goals we could establish in the comp plan to help you achieve your agency's goals?
I can start with a comment on that. Thank you. We often think of ourselves as wanting to achieve your goals also, and but that mention of how helpful it is to have, I'll just say it again, aspirational priorities in a comprehensive plan is very valuable for moving projects forward. It shows already that this is a priority for those citizens and for that community in Oregon. So when you go to do a project that is within that priority and you can say this is listed as a priority area in Clatsop County's comp plan, the funding is going to flow much easier, especially from state and federal sources, because that's what they want to know, is that there's public buy-in to these kinds of projects. So I think that's a really big deal, and why I think some of this, some of this planning could happen to designate areas of priority. They may or may not then have ordinances and laws that go with them, but going through the action of designating them can be very powerful for a lot of reasons. So that would be really helpful, I think, for the county to do its work and for groups like mine to do our work. And then, yeah, down at that down at that level of like land use laws and stuff, I'm not always familiar enough to know what is at the state level and what's at the county level and what's at the city level. But certainly if something is happening for conservation or restoration, like NCLC has had some times where we can't do a conservation project because the parcel crosses zoning, and so there can't be a subdivision, and so the landowner can't sell the land for conservation. They can only sell part of it, and then that simple part of it isn't valuable enough. And so there are some things like that where if it was, you know, if we could look at, I guess, some of those things that the county has control over, can they allow exception when it is for restoration or conservation? Maybe the way the county can allow exception for that kind of thing is because they've done, you know, some overlay plan ahead of time that says that these are these priority areas. So if they land in those priority areas, maybe they, you know, can have exception to some of those rules and ordinances.
I'll speak a little bit to the both of what Katie talked about. I agree that having areas that are designated as priorities can be very helpful, and I also think being aspirational and maybe having places that are identified but that don't have much in terms of policies attached to them, other than as a community we think these areas are important, can be a good way to look at some areas across the county. And we do conditional use permits with you guys all the time for our projects, and we're happy to continue to do them. And if there's ways where the county feels comfortable supporting restoration by finding some exceptions, that would be good too. But either way, you know, works for us.
This is Celeste. As long as we're being aspirational, I think the hardest thing about doing our work is finding the money to do the work. And so if we're just thinking completely out of the box, can some of the money that comes from tourism be directed towards habitat restoration or land acquisition, protection?
Here, here.
So Pat Corcoran here. I'm on the county level group, and I just want to thank you all for the particulars. I mean, it's an aspirational document, but it does need to be grounded in the wisdom of the specifics. And so, you know, we need to make that connection between the on the ground work that's valuable and how to get that in language that will support that work and all the work that's in the comp plan moving forward. So thanks for your specifics and willingness to work with us on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left before 5 o'clock. Does anyone have any general comments? Maybe someone from another agency or any closing remarks? Thanks.
This is Commissioner Webb. First of all, I'd like to thank the presenters just tremendously. This has been a real knowledge-filled but very practical presentation that has, I think, has really given us a lot to think about. One of the things that I think that we need to begin to wrestle with is that we're dealing with an extremely old comprehensive plan, and we really need new data to make decisions about the future. And so I'm really looking forward to the work that CREST is doing for us. And maybe that's the kind of thing we can adopt more procedurally for all of the goals, because all of them have technical aspects to them that demand reanalysis. I'd like to also thank I think it was Chris Farrar who said maybe we ought to be taking a look back and seeing what worked in the old comp plan and what didn't. And I think that's a very cool idea. That, you know, what constraints did it provide us, or what aspirations did it have that didn't work out? I think that kind of analysis, even though it's a very, very, very old plan, and I really almost am resistant to referencing it because the world has changed a lot in those 40 years. But I think this has been very informative, and I'd like to put forward a county policy that says you don't have to wring citizens to death over a 2-hour meeting. It's okay to stop the meeting a little bit early. So I would love to really express great thanks for all of the work, not only our presenters, but so many of our citizens who are hanging in there with us. And if I can be forward, I would just suggest that maybe the staff give everybody a break and a 7-minute start on the cocktail hour. So thank you all very, very much. This has been great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Not to eat into our 7-minute leap into the cocktail hour, Commissioner Webb, thank you. But this was a very good use of at least my 2 hours. So thank you to Victoria and to Gail for pulling this together. And thank you to all of the presenters today. I know that y'all are busy, and thank you for taking time to put this information together for us, and for being willing to work with us. Thank you.
Victoria, can you release us?
Yes, you are free. Enjoy your gin and tonics. Thank you so
Goodbye,
much,
everyone.
everyone. All
Thank
right.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.